Data Science and director of the Duke Forge Center for Actionable Health Data Science at Duke Health. He's also a professor of cardiology at Duke University and chair of the board of the People-Centered Research Foundation, which is what PCORI is now being called. Is that correct? It's a foundation linked with PCORI. And he also works as an advisor, but recently mentioned that he works half-time for Verily Sciences, Verily Life Sciences, a member of the Alphabet Group, also known as Google, or Google Health. And in 2015 to 2016, he was the Deputy Commissioner, and then from 2016 to 2017, the FDA Commissioner. And following that, went back to Duke as Vice Chancellor for Clinical and Translational Research, or he was before as well, Vice Chancellor for Clinical and Translational Research. Rob has done tremendous work in the area of clinical trials. He has over 1,200 publications. He's led several large cardiovascular outcome trials and has served on several advisory committees. He's a member of the National Academy of Medicine, served on several committees there, been on the board of scientific counselors for the National Library of Medicine, National Cancer Institute, several other NIH institutes. And he's also led major initiatives in improving methods in clinical research, including things like CITI and a public-private partnership between Duke and the FDA. And we're very pleased to have him. He's going to talk about getting clinical research data in the digital age. So welcome, Rob.
So can you hear me okay? Good. So it's great to be with you all. Let's see. Get the slide changer here. And what I thought I'd do is sort of give you a view of how the world is changing as it relates to generating evidence about health and healthcare as we're moving into the digital age. And for those of you looking for practical answers to questions, you are in the wrong room. You might want to go to the doctor's stay next door and get a really nice lunch. But if you're prepared to sort of begin to think differently, hopefully this will be a good place for you to be. So first of all, just to mention, I do have a lot of relationships with the medical products industry, but I do also, as Vivian mentioned, I work half-time for Verily Life Sciences. And just people always get confused about this, so it's worth just a minute. Alphabet is an umbrella corporation now that was formed as Google emerged from its core business into a number of other businesses like driverless cars and high-altitude balloons that are encircling the Earth to make the internet available in every square inch of the Earth and various things like that. And one of the elements from Google was the biomedical enterprise, and that's what Verily Life Sciences is. So think of it as a biomedical outlet for what used to be Google. Now Google is just one of 11 companies that are under the umbrella of Alphabet. But my employment there definitely affects the way that I think and my degree of enthusiasm for certain things that you should take into account in terms of conflict of interest. So we've already seen some maps this morning. I just want to start out with the perspective that it is absolutely essential now in this country that we both generate evidence in a different way and consume it in a different way. That is that we actually pay attention to the evidence and take action based on what we're seeing. And you know, if there is a main theme, it's that both at the level of human biology and at the level of clinical intervention and at the level of social and cultural intervention, there is no technical limitation to the ability to measure, intervene, and remeasure due to changes in the digital age. The limitations that we have are all cultural at this point. They're all in human interactions and how we deal with the technology, not the technology itself. So this is a picture of the United States and life expectancy by county in the United States. And but it turns out in almost every demographic depiction, red means bad health and blue means good health. And of course, what's intriguing about the map of the U.S. is there's almost a direct correlation between the voting patterns and the health status. And this is an emerging trend in all economically well-off countries, at least in Europe and North America. And it's also noticeable that we're standing in the middle of what I call the red zone. But if you take this down and code it down to individual counties or neighborhoods, you'd see the same kind of a pattern. And this is a little bit alarming, but what should really be alarming is this next slide, which shows the change in life expectancy. So we already have great disparities by geography, but these disparities are accelerating. They're not coming together. And it's something I believe we should all be very concerned about. There's also this bi-coastal pattern that people notice. I feel a little guilty because I literally live half-time in the bluest zone of North Carolina and half-time in San Francisco. So I'm frequently flying over all this redness and wondering what the hell is going on down there to cause this pattern. But it's something that we better be paying attention to. And the fastest deteriorating part of the population you'll see are, it's actually white men who live between Oklahoma and West Virginia. So something's going on that we need to do differently. And these are data from the group in Seattle that does the global burden of disease studies. It was really started at Oxford to help developing economies deal with their health issues. But they've recently gotten very interested in the U.S. because it looks like a developing country in reverse, a developed country in reverse at this point. When you analyze the data and say, what's behind these trends, as all public health people will tell you, it was obvious 100 years ago. It's the social determinants. It's wealth, education, where you live, sex, and race. Those are the big factors that, if you do a regression analysis, account for the majority of the differences that we see. But if you then say, let's not look at the social determinants, let's look at the biological manifestations of the social determinants, that's the second tranche of data there. And, you know, it's kind of interesting that the differences in things that we understand pretty well, lipids, exercise, smoking, obesity, diabetes, these are the big differences in these regions that are accounting biologically and clinically for the differences that we're seeing. But there is this other element that's fully intertwined with this, and I'll say a word more about the evolving biological picture in a minute, which has been termed by some economists as diseases of despair. And simply think about this as drugs, alcohol, and suicide. So here's a look at other economically well-off countries that we collaborate with and compete with and sometimes make fun of when we're feeling like American exceptionalists. And here are white non-Hispanics in the U.S., drugs, alcohol, suicide deaths. Very alarming pattern, and it's not flattening, it's continuing to accelerate. If you're not depressed enough already, America is exceptional in the top 18 high-income countries, and that all of the rest of them are continuing to see an improvement in life expectancy, except for the UK, which is just in the last year seen a dip in life expectancy. The one country out of the 18 that's exceptional is the U.S., in the purple there. We not only are in last place, but we're losing ground compared to other high-income countries in our aggregate life expectancy for both men and women. And we're about to experience our fourth consecutive year of a decline in life expectancy, something that's never been seen before in this country. The only year of a significant drop in life expectancy was 1918 in the Influenza pandemic. And this is a slide that's factual except for all the scribbling on it. I just took it off of Twitter because it does, I think, raise an interesting point. If you go way back to 1975, we looked like all the other high-income countries. And then decisions were made about health and healthcare. All the rest of the countries became better in terms of life expectancy at a lower cost. We're the lone country that diverged to have what you would think of in business as a really bad product, higher costs and worse results. And scribbling on there was to say there were efforts in the U.S. in the 70s to think about universal health care or health care as a right. That was rejected because it couldn't possibly work. All the other countries did it, and we're still saying it's can't possibly work and it's too expensive. Meanwhile, the other countries are sailing off into better outcomes. So a rational person might ask the question, why don't we just say healthcare is a right, develop a primary care system, then we look pretty good. And my answer to that is Churchill's quote, which is that Americans always do the right thing after using all other possibilities, exhausting all other possibilities. So, and I think because of who we are, it's unlikely that we're going to go the direction that's been successful for other countries, but I think we are now entering a different era where high-tech solutions are going to bring us to where we need to be if we pay attention to what's right in front of us. That's the information that we can now readily acquire. So to get into the mindset, now that hopefully you're motivated, that we've got to do something. Why is today different? And if you hadn't seen it before, I'm just going to give you the indoctrination from the World Economic Forum to the 4 industrial revolutions. And you don't have to accept this. It could be wrong, but I have drunk the Kool-Aid of Silicon Valley, and I believe it's right, that we're undergoing a transformation now, which is like the other industrial revolutions. And the way to think about the first is imagine that you're in a time where the only energy and power that can be created comes from human labor. It's a lot of work just to do the simplest thing. And then water and steam power come in, which was the first industrial revolution. So it was the first real possibility to mechanize production. And just as that was beginning to work for people, electric power came in. And that went from mechanized production now to mass production. A major change in society. A lot of people lost jobs. The status of work changed. The ability to have recreation at night, other than having sex, which may be better in the dark, especially as you get older, but we won't go into that in great detail. But other kinds of recreation at night became possible, and society flourished. And then, most recently, the third industrial revolution is one we're still sort of absorbing. We haven't really completely adapted to it, and that's the widespread availability of the internet and information technology. And it still astounds students today when I say, when I started doing the large acute heart attack trials on a global basis, the internet was not available. And so the amazing invention that allowed us to do these trials was the fax machine, which actually had been invented a long time ago, but wasn't widely available until right about the time we realized what was causing heart attacks. But now that we have the internet available, if you're like me, you're still struggling with how to deal with email, for example, which, when I got up this morning, I have a Google account and I have a Microsoft account for Duke, and they don't match, and it takes forever just to get through the email. But we're just at the very front edge of this fourth industrial revolution, which I believe is profound and has already affected us in ways that we don't even realize. And that's the fusion of all the sciences into information sciences. Everything is being digitized. And a simple way to think about this, if you're like some of the people that we heard from this morning in the biological sciences, when I was FDA commissioner, whole genome sequencing was becoming an issue. And if you're at the FDA, you worry about things like if you go to center A or center B, do you get the same result on your genome? And the answer was no. And so what we did was put sequence in the cloud and said, why don't you compete to see who can get the right right answer. So first of all, just being able to do that is purely a manifestation of digitization and cloud computing. But it turned out the winner was something called GAS, which is Google Accelerated Sciences. It was a group that had never done any biology in any of their history. It turns out the output of the data from a genome sequence is an image, and what they did was to take the image and apply the same science that allows you to tell cats from dogs on the internet. And it just beat all the other people hands down in terms of being able to get the sequence right. So if that's the case, that we're in this digital era, what's different about it? People tend to think about big data, the volume of data, but that's only one of the characteristics of the data that of the situation that's changed dramatically. These are the others that I list. You might even think of others beyond that. But the second is ubiquity. It used to be that you had to find as the internet developed, you had to find a cafe to get an internet site. A lot of towns in the U.S. still are poorly served, but by the time that Loon is done, this alphabet company, you will not be able to escape the internet no matter where you are on the face of the earth. And of course, the information, because of the reduction in latency, is instantaneously available. So a peasant in India with a cell phone, which has equal or greater density of cell phones to the U.S., has access to the same information at the same time that we do. And with cloud computing, essentially has access to the vast amount of data in real time. And then the fourth dimension of this is analysis. So because of the size, the ubiquity, the change in latency, there's a need for just-in-time analysis. And of course, everyone's talking about AI and the associated underlying sciences there. So all this is in motion. It's happening as we're sitting here, and it's very hard for us to figure it out and adapt to it. Now, what does this mean to somebody like me? Most of my career was spent dealing with late-phase clinical trials. And if you think about it this way, to do a late-phase clinical trial, you must have gone through a bunch of preclinical studies, animal models, cell cultures, everything had to line up and be okay. You then had to convince investors to put a huge amount of money behind you. And you had to convince an IRB and the FDA that it was okay to put your molecule into human beings. And yet, over half the phase 3 clinical trials that I led ended up getting an answer that was either neutral or negative. How can that be that after all that work, and in fact, in a study we did as I was leaving the FDA in 2016, it's still the case that for every 100 molecules that gets introduced into phase 1, only 10 make it to the market because of either off-target effects or because you engage the target, and the human biology is just different than whatever it was you saw in your pre-clinical model. So I've always thought of investigators as like this old parable of the blind man and the elephant. And the issue, of course, is that you're looking only at the slice of the elephant that you can see because you're limited by a number of things, including your computational capacity. The good news now is that we can not only look at the whole elephant, but we can look at the herd of elephants and the environment in which they're operating. There is not a computational limitation to being able to do this. And the question is, how do we change our human system so that we make it free ourselves to be able to take advantage of this new environment? A simple way to make the point that the world has changed around us and we hardly even think about it now. Some of you are old enough to remember the library. The library that you went into, there were all these shelves with all these musty books and periodicals, and the critical person in the library was the librarian who could understand the card catalog and how it worked. This is essentially history. All of this has been digitized, but beyond that, the modern library is this, and this is the actual number from 6 months ago. every half a second, there's 16.3 million questions being answered on search. And so you think about what it would take before to get a question answered. Go to the library, find the journal, periodical, look it up, find the right page. Now you just do the search. And this is the rate at which it's happening. It's very hard to sort of get your head wrapped around the pace at which this is continuing to change. Or another way of thinking about it is to ask what's in your cell phone of choice today. And if we took the same components and tried to make them available in 1985, it would have costed $32 million per cell phone. And of course, the amazing thing is, this is a trajectory just since 1985. I was old in 1985, and I'm still here, and it's still changing. So this is only the beginning of where we're eventually going to be. Well, so then when we think about evidence generation, so that we can make good decisions about what we're going to do, despite all these technological changes, as far as I'm concerned, the basic paradigm hasn't changed since 1985. Because a human being is so complicated and so multidimensional, it's still the case that we have to do these early translational steps, much of which we heard about today. They're very important. Out of those early translational steps, almost none of it works. A lot of it looks like it works, turns out, as we discussed this morning, to be completely irreproducible when someone tries to reproduce it. But a few things end up looking promising out of all the things that we do. And out of those few things, even fewer actually make it when we subject them to clinical trials in the intact human being. And out of the things that basically sort of make it through that phase, only a few really are good enough that they should be adapted into practice on a routine basis. And there's a systematic way of doing all of this. And for all the reasons I just gave you, the thought process was there in 1985, but the ability now to handle the computation needed to make this happen in a way that we can all monitor it is now with us. And the impediment is mostly health systems and doctors and people who now are the gatekeepers of that information. And the question is, how do we change it? Or another way of thinking about it, which is very much work in progress now, is that we used to think about the cycle of learning as sort of discrete chunks that you did separately and you waited between each chunk. But now, in the modern era, we should really think about this as a continuum which is constantly in motion and constantly interconnected. And I'm just going to make the point as we go through that the regulatory approval, which I was very involved with in my whole career and had a chance to sort of sit at the helm of the FDA and see how it works, needs to very integrally be linked with health technology assessment and payer decisions now. And as I'll try to show you, the same mechanisms in play there are going to begin to be available to people at home and also to clinicians who hopefully will help guide decision-making given the plethora of information that's available. So let's go back to the 1980s. As some people in the room know, I was incredibly spoiled because as a fellow, when the CCU director quit at Duke University, in those days you could be a fellow and an attending at the same time. So my chief called me in and said, how'd you like to run the CCU? You get to make the princely sum of $35,000 a year, which was a big raise. And you can be on call 12 out of 14 nights covering 2 hospitals. And I said, that sounds fantastic. I can hardly wait. But at the time, no one knew that blood clots caused heart attacks, because when people died from heart attacks, the pathologists couldn't find evidence of blood clots. Of course, now we know that was because of endogenous fibrinolysis, which happens when you die. And as I took over the CCU, the next month at the American Heart Association meetings, the first angiograms of people in the midst of heart attack were done. And guess what? There were big blood clots sitting in the coronary artery. So we had the target, the race was on, for whatever reason, captured the imagination of the whole world. And because we had access to computers that few other people had, we studied everything on a global basis with participation, using fax machines to collect the data to figure out which treatments work. And this looks mundane to people now, but at the time we started, these things were not accepted as effective treatment. They all had to be developed in randomized trials. And for every one that worked, there were at least 9 that we tried that didn't. And it's really important to remember that. Had we not done very large randomized trials, we never would have known out of all the things that looked good, and all the animal models looked good that brought these forward. If we had not done the human trials, we would have never known. And so then we had another problem. Even after you proved that something worked, no one would use it, because every doctor thought that he or she, something in medical school they were taught, that if you understood human biology, you would know which treatments to use in your patients. There was tremendous resistance. So we mounted a publicity campaign, and this was actually my favorite slide of all times, that got me in a lot of trouble, but also sort of upset a lot of people enough that they started to think about it. And the issue that we faced was we had proven that getting a beta blocker and an antiplatelet agent in the first 24 hours of a heart attack was life-saving. But with all the PhDs and MDs and nurses in the hospital, at the time we started, less than 50% of people in the U.S. were getting the antiplatelet drug and beta blocker within 24 hours. On the other hand, if you went to McDonald's, they have a metric that the store manager is responsible for getting napkin and ketchup in the bag with the cheeseburger over 99% of the time. And they do the audits at McDonald's, and if you don't succeed in that metric, you get sent to McDonald's University, literally a university, to learn about quality management. And so we use this slide, among many others, to sort of jolt the community into the idea that we needed to measure what we did in practice, that is, generate the evidence, test out the things that look good, figure out what works, and then implement what works in practice and measure that you do it. And as we did that, amazingly enough, if you did the right stuff, your patients were less likely to be dead. And this just seems so straightforward. And that, by 1990, I had assumed that within a decade or so, every specialty in medicine would be implementing such a routine. And in fact, the data continue to bear it out. It's just a look at what's happened to your risk of being dead if you have a heart attack as of 2009. And I think in a slide that I love, it just came out from an article from Harlan Krumholtz. If you look at the diamonds there in the middle, it just shows the progressive reduction in your risk of being dead if you have a heart attack. And I absolutely love this one. This shows your risk standardized rate of dying within 30 days. On the left-hand side, 2014. On the right-hand side, 1995, by hospital. And so even our worst hospitals today are better, essentially, than our average hospital in 1995 in terms of risk of death. And so this is the whole continuum. It took decades to work through all of this, and it's had a big impact. The sad news is, even within cardiology, the other areas have not taken up this approach to doing things for a whole variety of reasons that maybe we'll talk about in the Q&A. So to come back to the evidence continuum, I'm just going to sort of go through what's changing about how we can collect evidence at every level now. Let's start with a single human being. And here I want to acknowledge this is like the ultimate conflicted slide. I'm a faculty member at Duke and Stanford, and I'm the sponsor of the study because I work with Verily. So just keep that in mind. This is a conceptual idea, not the specific study that you need to pay attention to. And the analogy here is, imagine that it's 10 years ago and you just picked up your first iPhone. And I come up to you and I say, in a couple of years, that phone is going to be part of your car, and you are going to get into your car when you want to go somewhere and you'll tell your car where you want to go, your car will talk back to you and tell you how to get from where you are to where you want to go. And the reason for that is because every road between where you are and where you want to go has been mapped. It's a fundamental architecture of the system. And artificial intelligence is taking feedback from every component of that map, integrating it, forming decisions, and offering you decision support in the form of a human voice that you can interact with. You probably would have said you're out of your mind. But imagine today if I said, you want to go, like I want to go to the airport, very important to get home for the basketball game tonight. I want to go to the airport. Imagine that Vivian said, well, get in your car, and if you feel lost, pull off the side of the road, open the glove compartment, take out a map, unfold it, try to figure out where you are, or if you're a man, God forbid, roll down the window, ask for directions. And then, a couple of blocks later, you may feel lost again, do the whole thing. And I would say, why on earth would I do that? I can just talk to my car, and it can tell me where to go. Or hopefully my Lyft or Uber driver will do that. But the problem is, we don't have a fundamental map of the human condition. It's obviously a lot more complicated than just mapping roads, but there's no technological limitation to doing that. So that's what the baseline study is. With a large group of volunteers, we're trying to develop a data ingestion engine that will map the human condition, including over time. And Vivian mentioned that I think you all are joining all of us now with funding now being approved, if I understand it correctly. And this data ingestion system, by the way, will be a public good because it'll be part of the All of Us study. Just to give you an idea of the quantity of data that we're collecting, this is just the biological data, 6 terabytes per person in the first 2 days, but that's the smallest part of the data. The biggest part of the data now is sensors and other devices that follow people when they're at home or going about doing whatever it is that they're doing. And sources of these data are extraordinarily complex and multidimensional. But as I say, it's not a computational problem. It's really a matter of putting the structures together in a way that you can normalize the data and come up with terms that can be used across different types of measurement systems. And if you want to read a paper about part of this that I think is really good, it's Tom Insel's article in JAMA on digital phenotyping. And the idea here is that there are many characteristics of what people do that tell you a lot about who they are and what their health is. My favorite one that was a new word for me when he wrote the paper was prosody, which I had not thought much about, but it's a small part of what I work on now, and it's the idea that the prose that people use, even if you don't analyze the content, the cadence and the way that they talk tells you a lot about the person. For example, if you're depressed, you sound differently and you use different rapidity of speech as you get more and more depressed. It's also the case if you just follow the cell phone in the pocket, someone with depression, the more depressed they get, the smaller the radius of movement of the cell phone. You don't have to know anything about what they're doing with the cell phone. You just follow where it goes. And of course, when someone's depressed, the cell phone is sitting there for days in a row. It's a pretty bad sign about the status of that person. All right, so that's the individual, but we also now have groups of individuals where it's very hard to know what to do with data about an individual unless you have other people to compare it to. So you need populations. And this is where steps 2, 3, and 4 come in. And unfortunately, the best information comes when we do interventions, one type or another, and then measure what happens afterwards. Sometimes the interventions are natural interventions, and often they're experimental. But our experimental system, for sure, is really messed up. It's not delivering the goods that we need right now. And the biggest problem in the system is not the patients. The patients actually want to participate in clinical studies. The problem they most often cite to the question of why don't you participate, the most common reason is because my doctor never asked me to do it. And in surveys of doctors now, we're finding a tremendous amount of resistance, not because they don't want to participate, but because they feel completely overwhelmed by the American system of healthcare and don't feel like they have the time to spend to participate. So we've got work to do on this. And the result of this is that when we go to do interventional studies now, the rate of inflation in costs is 3 times the rate of the consumer price index. This is obviously not a sustainable way to meet the need that we have for evidence. And let me tell you, we need evidence. So a decade ago, I was feeling really like I was a cardiologist. We're the most evidence-based specialty. So we took the guidelines for the American College and American Heart Association and the European Society of Cardiology and just asked the question, what percentage of the time are our major recommendations based on high-quality evidence? And the answer was less than 15%. Now, the good news for cardiology, that's still the best of any specialty. My little brother's an orthopedic surgeon. They don't even bother to count because there's almost no evidence for most of what's being done in orthopedic surgery. A decade later, we just published this paper in JAMA and took another look at it, and lo and behold, we've actually gotten worse. Now, it's a little tricky because it's fair to say when you discover, for example, that percutaneous intervention lowers the risk of death and heart attack, then you got another set of questions like how do you do it, what kind of catheter you use. So it's not quite as bad as it looks, but let's just say that we have a huge chasm between what people need to know to have the best health and the evidence that we have. And this is, different in different subspecialties, but none of them look particularly good. And just to show again that it hasn't changed in a decade in terms of the proportion of evidence that we have. So we can't keep doing it the way we've been doing it. It's not right. And of course now the digital environment gives us a chance to really do it differently. And in addition, the cultural change that's happened, for better or worse, is that we're all aggregated now into large health systems that are finite in number. These health systems all have an imperative for business reasons to collect data from every component of the health systems to be able to run the businesses. And now the question is, can we take that digital information and make it useful? It's very much work in progress. We're not all the way there, but whoops. Significant progress is being made. And the number of health systems is now actually countable. It went 25 years ago, I never thought I'd see the day when you could actually count the number of health systems in the U.S. because every practice was a small business that was running on its own. This was the genesis of CoreNet, which you all have been a very important part of. And the idea here is, can we align health systems, clinicians, and patients, and payers to answer the questions that are relevant to them, taking advantage not just of the claims data that we've gotten pretty good in using, but also beginning now to curate the electronic health record data and then eventually bring in other data. So, if it was just as easy as a picture here, we'd be in great shape. But in fact, we've now got 34 or so health systems representing about a third of America and a number of activated patient groups after a big national investment ready to go on this. Still, I would say the biggest problem we have is engaging the clinicians. We now know from the data resource who the patients are, what their problems are, a lot of fairly detailed information about the patients. We know who the clinicians are, but linking the patients to the clinicians in a productive way, I think is the biggest issue that we're still struggling with, and so is everyone else trying to do this. You'll see you're prominently featured here. Louisiana has been a shining light in this effort. And I never thought I'd see payers involved in doing research because it's been a long road to try to make that happen, but we've got 2 enthusiastic payer groups now involved in this. So the total number of people in whom we have data, 60 million or so for clinical trials and 100 million for observational studies. So if you're studying chronic diseases, you should be able to mount a study fairly quickly with a large sample size, whatever the sample size is that you need, if you're studying rare disease, of course the big issue is how do you find the people who have the rare diseases, because no single health system has enough to do it. It should be possible to identify now a significant number of people with rare disease. So we're just entering the production phase now. We've been through the sort of investment and build-up phase, and I hope this will very rapidly take off as an infrastructure system for all investigators to use. The motto that I have about the system is it should be characterized by the willingness to do research which is designed and organized by someone else. The big problem in the academic centers is because of the tenure and promotion system, people are taught you have to control your own study even if it's a bad study. And we used to have this thing between FDA and NIH where we meet once a quarter, and one of the biggest problems of clinical studies that you see on clinicaltrials.gov is most of the studies that couldn't possibly answer a meaningful question are coming from academic medical centers. And we used to have a term for it. We called them SCTs, small crappy trials. And when we did investigation on why this was happening, the answer was, well, we don't have enough money to do the thing we'd really like to do. And we've got all these trainees, they have to do something. And it seemed kind of odd that you would train people to do meaningless studies that couldn't answer a useful question as a way of operating the system. And we have this enormous need for high quality evidence about things that we all need to know about the diseases that we have. And built into the federal law now, because of recognition of this, is the view that we need to go from a system where things just sort of happen willy-nilly. And then when we want to do a clinical trial, we design a clinical trial, we recruit the sites, do the case record form and all, and then do the trial, and then tear it all up and start over again with the next trial. And where surveillance of products that are on the market happens through spontaneous reporting. Now, I don't know if any of, those of you who practice, pretty hard to find a doc who's actually sent in an adverse event report given all the other things that they have to do. But the idea now is to have a system that's running all the time, so you have numerators and denominators all the time about medical products and can really assess the safety and effectiveness after they're on the market. When I say it's written into the law, I literally mean it's written into the law. Both the 21st Century Cures Act that was passed in 2016 and also the user fee agreements with the medical products industry, which I had a lot of fun being the guy in the back room when these were negotiated. About half the FDA budget comes from user fees on the industry. And then those agreements between the industry and FDA have to get put into law by a vote of Congress and signed by the President. So this is now the law of the land that the FDA is instructed to make real-world data, real-world evidence a focus, and to move the system along as a means of running the evidence generation system. All right, so that's the individual and the healthcare system the way we think of it. Now to the fun part, at least from my perspective. The analytical part of this is changing things radically under our feet. I don't know about Tulane and LSU, but many academic medical centers now are beginning to incorporate machine learning into everyday practice. And the ability to use natural language processing is beginning to make a difference. An example that I'm very involved in the alphabet world is screening for diabetic retinopathy. We've got a problem that we have millions and millions of people with diabetic retinopathy. Most never get screened. When you do see an ophthalmologist, a pretty good job is done. But now with a simple picture of the eye with an undilated picture and machine learning, we can do as well, actually better than the routine ophthalmologist and as well as a retinal specialist in detecting the presence of the grade of diabetic retinopathy. So obviously, if you're in India or rural Louisiana or South Carolina, where I grew up, you could go to your local Walgreens, get a picture, and for a couple of bucks, you can get an assessment of your diabetic retinopathy once all this gets done, because the transmission of the image and the analysis is all done in the cloud and not dependent on local geography. One thing we're doing at Duke, like like a lot of people are doing, we have now a managed care population where we're responsible for their overall outcomes for a fixed cost. And the question is, if you have 100,000 people who are roaming around out there enjoying their lives, how do you know in whom you should focus your attention? Because waiting for them to come to the hospital is not a good way to preserve money and have good clinical outcomes. And so what we do now is that every day we run a machine learned model on all the information that's come in on all those people and predict the risk that hospitalization will be needed as a probability and rank order all those people, and the ones who are the highest risk get the attention of the care managers as a priority. Fairly simple thing to do computationally now. And the beauty of this is that there is no limit to the number of predictions you can make about individual conditions. It's now just a matter of getting the ground truth in a big enough population that you can run the algorithm, because the algorithm is automated. It can be run any time of day or night on any number of conditions that you'd like to do it. And then, of course, many hospitals have sepsis models now, like we did, where, I don't know, I ran an intensive care unit for 25 years, and, you know, the great intensive care unit doctor could assimilate all this information and pontificate about, you know, diagnosis and all. But now the amount of data coming in is just way beyond what any human being can deal with. So the information now streams in from all sources. The computer looks at it and basically runs an algorithm, and when the probability of sepsis hits a certain level, a hand goes up in the computer that calls the sepsis team in to evaluate the patient. It looks like many hours before the typical diagnosis of sepsis would be made clinically. Well, you might say, who needs a doctor after all this? And I just have one word for that: Boeing. I think at the basis of Boeing is going to be a sensor that wasn't integrated well into the artificial intelligence in the airplane, and the pilots weren't trained enough to make the correction in the 45 seconds that they had, which I'm gathering now is the amount of time they had to make the human correction. So, very good friends with Eric Topol. I would recommend the book. He just wrote his third book. It's on artificial intelligence in medicine. I completely agree with his primary conclusion is that if we use artificial intelligence correctly, it will actually increase the need for clinicians, and will make clinicians' jobs a lot more fun because they'll be interacting with people instead of wasting their time typing into a computer. I love the term keyboard liberation, which is now a mantra for Silicon Valley to solve the natural language processing issue of having a clinic visit without the need for any typing at all. Because if you can talk to your car and get from point A to point B, why can't you talk with a patient and have a clinic note generated that you just have to check instead of typing while the poor patient is trying to talk to you? Well, and then we get into the wilder world, and this one has really got to be fun for me because there are about 3 billion people that do a Google search every day. 1 in 20 are health related. And a simple way to think about this is for every question someone has about health, there is an answer on the internet. There is. And so the question is, how good are those answers? And the answer right now is not very good. But, you know, before I got there, the effort had started to produce what's called the Knowledge Panel, which is a very simple, high-level, curated, high-quality, reliable information source, but it's not very interactive. And so I was really excited that a decision was made to hire David Feinberg to come into Google. David was the CEO of Geisinger Health System, so he knows a lot about what I've been talking about. And he's a child psychiatrist, which will equip him beautifully for dealing with the Google environment. And the issue is, what can you do now to create a system where people can get reliable health information? Starting with a source where anonymity is absolutely essential. I don't know about you, but there's certainly searches that I've done that I would not want any of you to see. You can think about that for yourself. So the anonymity of Google search is absolutely essential. but it would be entirely possible to ask you, would you like to go to another space where you can interact? It might end up with identifiable information because to help you, we need to compare your information with other people like you to help you answer the questions that you have about yourself. And the initial exploration into this has been in the area of depression. There are two areas of the internet where the First Amendment does not pertain. One is terrorism, the other is suicide. So we've reached agreement, including legal cases where you do not have the First Amendment right to post terrorism things on the internet. They're taken down as quickly as possible. You do not have the First Amendment right to encourage people to commit suicide. But beyond that, what about plain old depression? About 300 million people in the world who are depressed. About half of them actually never get treated. I bet there are a lot of people in rural Louisiana and South Carolina who never really get treated. Those who do get treated, it looks like it's about 7 years from the onset of symptoms until the first treatment. But they're on search, very identifiable. Treatment is effective. It's not curative, but there is an effect. So what we've done is to take people searching for depression and give them a pop-up that says, would you like to take a survey on depression? And if they say yes, then they take the PHQ-9, which is the medically validated questionnaire for depression. I can't give you the exact number, but I'll just say that we have millions and millions of Americans that have filled out this survey to look like they're pretty severely depressed. All that happens now is they get referred to the patient advocacy group for depression called NAMI. But, and you might say, well, why don't you refer them to a therapist? But would we refer them to Tulane or LSU? I don't know. We have a lot of questions like that are hard. But then you begin to say, well, that's depression. What about diabetes? What about people getting up in the middle of the night peeing and are searching on peeing in the middle of the night? You know, so we know about a lot of disease out there which is currently untreated by people who may never have an occasion to talk to a doctor about it, maybe until it's too late. So this is a look at what search looks like in the inner part. And I want to make just one point here, I guess 2 points. One is, because of the computational capability, everything that happens on search is looked at all the time. Now that doesn't mean it's identified. In fact, you know, the lack of identification of individuals is a pretty serious issue, because if that ever didn't happen, this would go out of business. But it's constantly looked at to try to make it better. When you try to make it better, the question comes up, do you just make it better by guessing, or do you make it better by knowing that it's better? And one of the keys to Google about why it succeeded is that it was learned very early on that if you want to know that it's better, you better randomize. So when you search on Google, you're participating in more than one randomized trial every time that you do it. Because every improvement that's made in the system, unless it's really obvious, is subjected to a randomized trial. Now, it's easy for them because they randomize 10 million people in an hour, and so the outcomes come in at pretty high rates. But here we are with a business being run very successfully because they're not guessing about what to do next. In medicine, for the most part, we're just guessing. We really don't know what to do because we haven't done the right studies. And then the final point I want to make is, even if you've done the right studies and you know, that is not enough. And if there's one thing I want to leave you with, is that you need to be scared out of your mind right now about misinformation on the internet. And in fact, the terminology that we're using now is misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Misinformation would be like Dr. Oz. He's offering an alternative for whatever the proven treatment is, and some people use it. But I know Dr. Oz personally. He actually spent 1 week as a Duke surgical trainee. I don't think he's advertising a bunch of stuff which is terribly bad. Disinformation would be purposely trying to cause a problem or hurt somebody with something on the internet. That would be like offering an alternative cancer treatment that you know doesn't work, or a stem cell treatment for $100,000 for a desperate parent when you know it doesn't work. And then there's malinformation, which is basically cyber warfare, and is a very purposeful government-sponsored effort to hurt people in another country. More of that going on than you probably want to know. Now, unfortunately, aiding and abetting all of this is the fact now, proven through empirical research, that misinformation reaches more people faster and lasts longer on the internet than truthful information. And it looks like the reason for that is that cognitively, if you make it up, you're not burdened by uncertainty and having to give caveats. You just lie about it, and you sound very definitive. That is very pleasing to the average person. You have a definitive person. It's kind of like one reason doctors don't enroll people in clinical trials is that you got to admit that you don't know the answer to get consent. And a lot of people might say, well, I'll just go next door where the doctor does know the answer, even though the doctor next door is obviously making it up if you're doing a clinical trial. But beyond that, if you look at the anti-vax effort, a very high proportion of anti-vax social media is now coming from Russian bots as a form of cyber warfare. And it's very clever because it's not just anti-vax. They're telling the anti-vax people this is a socialist conspiracy. But they're telling the pro-vax people that those anti-vax people are stupid idiots and, you know, you should just do something bad to them. So they're taking the divisions that already exist and magnifying them using social media. So this is a key message. Hopefully I've convinced you that the technology is changing faster than you might have even thought. But basically people's brains still work the same. And we've got to figure out, and I think the people who are you can say it's Silicon Valley's fault, but depending on Silicon Valley to solve this problem is not the right approach. This is something universities, academic medical centers really need to be working on, because the mission, when I wear my university hat, is to seek the truth and disseminate it. If that's our mission, why are we acting more like corporations and not like people who are activated to get the truth out there? So I'll leave you with this slide, which I think is still intact. It's a gold standard. We can have a lot of ideas about what would work, but we've got to test them. And we not only have to develop the ideas in preclinical models, we have to do the studies in humans. We have to do them in adequate scale to get reliable answers. And then even after we've got the answer, we have to implement and measure the implementation. And where we find problems with implementation, we have to seriously go after the issue of how do we help people get into the right mindset, whether it's a McDonald's hamburger slide or whatever it takes. Convincing people by giving them more logic is not the solution to it. That's one thing that's proven. It's going to take a different set of approaches to get to where we need to go. So hopefully this gives you a few things to think about, and thanks for inviting me to.
Centuries ago, and it still works more or less that way. We react to things emotionally. One reason why fake news works better than real news is that it's designed to trigger emotions. In academic health centers, we do those crappy little trials we're talking about because we get rewarded for individual credit by designing those studies. So I would take away the message that what we have to work on is a better system of human training. To offer rewards and if necessary negative reinforcement for behaviors that will work better in the new environment, because we don't have that right now.
I agree. And I think academia needs to take it much more seriously than we all give lip service to team science now, but it's not the way it's working for the most part. And giving up your crappy little trial to participate in something that's going to answer something that matters a lot to 1 million patients. It's very hard to do if you're in an academic center right now. So we've got to work on it. I agree. Yeah.
So there's actually another guy who's got one of those fancy non-dilated retinopathy exam machines, and he started showing these pictures. I get very, very excited because I know people are doing that. He's not interested in that, I think, because people have already done that. His major concern, what keeps him up at night, is that the exam itself is inferior to a dilated exam because the non-dilated exam doesn't visualize the entire retina. And so the study he really wants to evaluate is comparing people, not the accuracy of the exam itself and machine learning prediction, but is it actually inferior to standard treatment? It actually keeps him up at night. It's just so from the data science perspective.
First of all, I mean, I ran intensive care units and nothing keeps me up at night. I can go to sleep on the spot. And I think he's interested in a subset of something where the answer is much more complicated than that depiction. So yes, if everyone could see the best retinal specialists in the world and that was the standard of care, that would be wonderful. But we have millions of people who get no exam right now, or who get an average exam, which is worse than the undilated exam with machine learning. So, I mean, if he wants to solve the problem of having trained enough excellent retinal specialists and have them accept that, you know, $10,000 a year they're going to get paid if they're all doing this to do it, then I would say more power to them. But that doesn't mean I don't think there's value in doing the study he wants to do. I think understanding the difference is an important component of what needs to do. But I wouldn't do it for the, and calling it standard of care what you described, I'm sorry, but
Standard of care is actually not an eye exam already.
and even when it is an eye exam, the variability among ophthalmologists, we have really good data on this. Go to the ophthalmologist next door, you get a different answer. I'm not going to say what percentage of the time, but it's significant. By the way, I'm a cardiologist. We did this with angiograms in 1980, and it was cardiologists agree with themselves 3 weeks apart on the same angiogram about 75% of the time. So you go to the same cardiologist 3 weeks different with the same picture, you'll get a different answer for it.
Yeah, we were chatting before about electronic medical records, which we all hate, but it's really been a revolution. And I think there's potential there in terms of, I mean, it really is a sort of a learning network that we're plugged into. And it could be used for things like, you know, increasing the interest in clinicians in research and QA efforts and educational efforts and sort of almost a machine learning network. There's got to be clever ways to use it because we're all stuck in front of the darn thing anyway.
Yeah, so I'm bullish now. A year ago when I first arrived in Silicon Valley, I was overwhelmed and not confident because, you know, software engineers get interested in whatever they're interested in, not necessarily the problems that doctors have and the patients have. But now I think we're well on our way. I think the competition is on for developing natural language process clinic notes, so you will not, and there's a great paper today from my colleagues at Google about some of the problems with phrases that people use which are imprecise. But that's just, you know, that's like when Google Maps and Siri started out. You know, it took a while to understand all the dialects and to ask again until you got something that was intelligent. And so I think it's just a matter of time until that's done. You can also say, why should anybody take a review of systems in a clinic? You should just be able to talk to your home device that does the review of systems, and when you need to see a clinician, the clinician should have something in English that points them to the problems that you're dealing with so that you don't waste time sitting there with some stupid paper form or tablet or whatever it is. There's just no reason. And the technology is so inexpensive now, I can assure you within 5 years, every health system will be giving away their device of choice for free just because it's going to be the competitive way to do business. And you got a lot of obesity, I've noticed, in Louisiana. Now, if I told you the way to treat obesity is to have a person try to figure out how to call and make a clinic appointment and then wait 3 months, then go sit in a waiting room for an hour, and then get hustled into an office where a doctor's typing into a computer, and then get thrown out of the office within 12 minutes because that's the amount of time the doctor has, where literally what we can see on search is that people are searching from the time they leave the doctor's office trying to figure out what the hell the doctor was talking about. Why would you ever do it that way when you can have a device at home and virtual visits and see the clinician to deal with the issues that come up in that content? So that's what I see.
Last question. What about privacy? People are getting very worried about it. I'm ready to go into a cave, except I'm worried that lots of other people will come into the cave.
Well, you have that option. I would bet, knowing you, that within about 15 minutes you're going to want to see the next journal article, and you're going to have to go get online to get it. So we got a lot to work out here. And by the way, this is why I say the people most asleep at the wheel, in my opinion, are universities and academic medical centers, because we have a balance here we have to reach, and we don't know where it is right now. And to get that balance, you need medical people, you need lawyers, you need public policy people, you need ethicists, you need religion people, you need sociologists, you need cognitive psychologists, and somewhere in there we've got to find the balance again. And the lesson from Silicon Valley is if you give some people something useful, they're almost always willing to give up a lot of privacy. But you have to give them something useful. And they don't perceive, for example, right now that the EHR is all that useful. So, I have my own personal solution, but it's not like there's an intellectual answer to this issue. It's more, how do we find a balance and a set of societal expectations that enable us to take advantage of the technology without hurting people while we're doing it.